reading just Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we might think he's calling them for the first time, but we read the Gospel of John and we find out, oh, of course, he already knew these people. They were part of John's movement. So he's not calling them for the first time. He's regrouping John's disciples.
Wait. Pop the brakes. I've never, ever, until I read this book and talked to James, heard the concept that Jesus probably knew who his first disciples were ahead of time and then called them to continue on the work of what John the Baptist. All right, what's up, friends? Dr. James McGrath. It is truly a pleasure to have you on. You've been on the podcast now. This is your second time with me, but you've also been part of our Theology 101 Zoom group, and you've taught there to quite a few people. So it's always a pleasure. Thank you for making time. It's great to see you again.
No, it's. I just love these conversations. We always have great ones. Yeah. Is there a record for the number of times? Because I'm like the competitive sort, you know.
You have to beat Trip Force, which is probably a close, maybe 5 or 6 times on the podcast.
Oh yeah, no, Trip gets around too much. I probably can't keep up with him.
He does. Well, the last time I had you on, we were talking about your book called The A to Z of the New Testament. I highly recommend it. It's a great book. My father-in-law currently has it, and he listens to the podcast. So, Dad, please return the book. It's been a long time now, okay? If you haven't finished it yet, I want it back. But it really is a great book. It brings people through things that Bible scholars like yourself wish everyone knew about the New Testament. And it goes from A to Z. It is very enlightening. Each chapter is really succinct. It's very understandable for common folks like myself who have questions, but don't have the time to spend hours reading really dense books. And so I wanted to bring you back on because you have another book out. Well, technically it's 2 books, but this is the layman edition, I guess we can say. It's called Christmaker, A Life of John the Baptist. It's right here. And, I've read about half of it so far. Wow, very cool. So I figured I would bring you back on because I like having folks join me on the show who can really unpack what's going on when it comes to biblical characters or the Bible itself that paints maybe a more complete, a more full picture from the one that we've had as evangelicals kind of growing up. So I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah, me too. And did you say your father-in-law has A to Z? Because
yes.
If he's listening, not only Tim wants his book back. That's between you and him. But I want to know, what did you think of it? So
yes.
Let me know somehow. I think, and I didn't realize this until I became a book author myself. But I think as an avid reader, I never assumed that authors would ever care what I or anyone else thinks. But it's just, when I've heard from people who've, just really appreciated and, maybe even been, moved or inspired or something by something I've written, that's what keeps me going.
Totally.
Right? So both if you want to keep me doing the sort of thing I'm doing, then, give me that positive feedback. If you want to prevent me from making the same mistakes again and writing these kinds of books, then you might be able to achieve that too. Because it only takes a little bit of negative criticism often to, get us to have, be filled with self-doubt and stop doing things. So
as a content creator who spends most of his day making videos for Instagram and YouTube and podcasting, I agree. You can have 1,000 positive comments about how great whatever it is that you said was, and one comment that's like, no, this is garbage. And then that one is in your head all day, right? Just sitting, maybe I'm a failure, maybe I missed it. So I resonate with that. I want to start here. You actually wrote 2 books about the same person, John the Baptist. One, from my understanding, is more of an academic read. The other is more of a typical, layman read, like someone like me, just picking up off the shelf, want to read it. Why 2 books? And also, why John the Baptist?
Yeah. Why 2 books is the one that's really going to puzzle people. Why spend a full year I took a year-long sabbatical for the first time.
Wow.
Thinking about, of all people, John the Baptist. I'm sure some people want to know that, but why 2 books? And why on earth 2 books is a question that I think is going to be even more in people's minds. And the reason is because, on the one hand, I guess to start with, before A to Z of the New Testament, right? If you go back to some of my earlier books, like What Jesus Learned from Women, it's one that I wanted to be for academics, but also wanted it to be of interest to a general readership. And so I tried to do both things at once. And Murphy's Law says if you try to please everyone, no one will like it.
Yeah.
certainly if you try to write for all audiences, I think I imagined earlier in my career that that's what publishers want, when probably they were shaking their heads every time I'd submit a book proposal. They'd accept them anyway, because apparently I had something worth saying, but they'd be like, he thinks he's going to write for everyone? Really? Oh, please. Right. And so with this one, I said, I want to tell the stories about visiting the places, right? I want the anecdotes. I want to talk about the stereotypes of John the Baptist and do all the general audience stuff. And I want to explore the big picture, right, of what his life might be like. But I knew that I'm going to have some unconventional conclusions and some unconventional ways of approaching things, use some sources that haven't been given the attention that they're due, and that all of those things would be controversial with academics, right? The average reader might think, well, sure, why not, right? Or
what's the big deal?
No, either way, but they're, if they're interested, there'll be this bigger book, which is not just an expanded, more heavily footnoted version of Christmaker. This is the one that will have these detailed defenses, explorations, explanations of some of the more controversial points. So, for instance, can we use Mandaean sources in investigating John the Baptist? Are these ones even worth considering? Can we reconstruct, an ancient infancy tradition about John the Baptist? Prayers of John the Baptist in the Mandaean tradition, Syriac tradition, stuff like that. I'm guessing there are a few people listening to this who are like, oh gosh, that doesn't sound at all interesting, right?
So that's why that probably, stuff is. I mean, no offense to you, but even me, I'm like, what are we talking about here? Like, okay, sure. It sounds. I don't know what to even say. Like, what tradition? Infancy narratives. Yeah. So yes, that is a fair point. I would say, suffice to say, most people listening are like, kind of over my head. I'm not gonna lie, James, kind of over my head.
And so that's that stuff I was just talking about, not even in Christmaker, right? But the more detailed research, exploring some sources that are neglected, things like that,
right?
That's reflected in the way that I put together John's life, right? Taking into account a wide array of sources, not least of which is Jesus himself, right? Because if John made a big impact on the life of Jesus and his teaching and his outlook, then just as people have looked to John, hoping that John can help us understand Jesus better, which I think he can, the reverse is also true, right? We can look at Jesus and say, okay, let's use him as a way of filling in what we know about this person who had such a big impact on him.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's then, for the duration of our conversation, let's focus on the book that you wrote for the general population. People like me, right? Like, want to be theologians, want to understand this stuff, but just need some help kind of getting there. Here, let's just start real big picture. And I want you to kind of clarify for the audience what you found. You spent a year sabbatical. You were actually in Israel, correct? For a lot of your research and just like looking at actual places that John might have walked, et cetera. Is that correct?
So I took a trip to Israel, including Samaria and other places I hadn't gotten to before. Drove myself around for the first time, and so went to these out-of-the-way places that are not on the standard itinerary. And share some of the stories in the book, but I'm happy to get into more detail and behind-the-scenes stuff here. Have amusing anecdotes beyond those that waded into the book. Then spent a term in Oxford in England, where there are some manuscripts and sources that are relevant to this project, and then was back in England at the end of the sabbatical year in Durham, and also made it to the state of Georgia for part of the sabbatical. Not because there was a direct connection with John the Baptist, but because they were willing to have me in this semester-long visiting position that had a salary connected, and that was crucial to making this year-long sabbatical possible.
Let me ask you a question then. Is it safe to say that you really went to the primary sources for these two books? Like, you actually went to, as primary as we can get in 2024, manuscripts, locations, geographical spots, monasteries. I mean, you went to the source as much as we can today to write this book. Is that fair to say?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I was almost going to interject, the scholars say, we say, is it safe to say? I was going to just jump in and say no, right? Because that's what academics do, right? We're cautious. It's like, it's safe to say, well, and that's another reason why I wanted to write the general audience book, is that there's a place for the hemming and hawing and the hesitation and the careful nuancing that means that the sentences are 3 pages long. But
Right.
I didn't want to do that for people who just want to know, how have we got John the Baptist wrong, right? Because I became increasingly persuaded that we do have these stereotypes, these misperceptions, and that's the main answer, the answer that is of general audience interest about why John the Baptist, right? To come back to that question you asked.
Yeah.
It's that I think if we get John wrong, we get Jesus wrong a lot of the time, right? Either because we play them off against one another as though they were radically different and maybe even opposed at some point, or we think that, maybe they're on the same page, but we've misunderstood John and therefore we get Jesus wrong as well.
So here's the picture I was given of John the Baptist, as I understand him to be. He was definitely a wild man. He wore animal skin, so I picture almost like a caveman type of person. Maybe a little mentally unstable at times, a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs at times. Yes, you're holding up. Yes, that's pretty much how I picture him. Super hairy, super wild. He prepared the way for Jesus. He was kind of the one who was like, listen, guys, Jesus is coming. We're all going to follow him. That's kind of the vibe I was given. And also that he was seen by his own people as a crazy man. Like John the Baptist was kind of out there and he liked to live in the wilderness. So I just picture forest or like dense terrain, maybe somewhere in like the mountains, etc. That's how I picture John the Baptist. On a scale from 1 to 100, how much of that, based on your research, is factually accurate?
Let's separate the parts.
Okay.
Because some of it I want to say 0, some of it 5, and some of it to be like, no, that part's probably okay.
Okay, good.
So the caveman vibe, right? The animal skins, that's one that's really problematic, and I want to say just sort of 0 in the sense that what the sources say is that he wore clothing made of camel hair. And when I give talks about John the Baptist now, I've got this, showing my age, but this Remington Steele, in a camel hair jacket and suit and stuff. We can still get camel hair clothing today, and camel hair clothing is not the same as wearing a camel skin. But you're not wrong, right? So one thing that sort of AI and Google search and things like that is very good at is indicating our biases. Right? Because unless somebody goes in and interferes with things, then it will reinforce them and it will show. And so I was looking for pictures of John the Baptist from film and television to put in a slide in order to illustrate this preconception that people have, right? Because his hair gets wilder and wilder, the skins get furrier and furrier. Yeah. And it gave me, like Greatest Story Ever Told and, Jesus of Nazareth and, The Chosen and all these different, depictions of him. And then it gave me Michael York playing a caveman in 1 million BC, right? As part of the same search result.
Right.
Because to this AI, that looked like the same kind of thing.
Right.
And so we have depicted him in a way that AI recognizes as looking like a caveman, right? And so I think that's about as...
Yeah, I mean, okay, so to kind of put him in our cultural moment, I picture him, there's an older Christian rock metal band called The Devil Wears Prada. Okay, and they have this song called Danger Wild Man. And this intro, it's real heavy. I know uncles! But it's a real heavy intro. It's a lot of metal. It's, very mosh pit kind of vibes. A lot of screaming. That's how I picture John the Baptist. He's like, he's somewhere in his tent in 2024 America, off the beaten path, wakes up in the morning, throws on his metal, eats some whatever, bugs or worms, and goes, prepare ye the way of the Lord, and then screams. That's kind of how I picture him.
Right. And I should have had a guitar for him to play. I'd be like, repent.
Exactly.
The kingdom of God is at hand.
Yes, that's how I picture him. Just very intense, a very intense human being.
So I think there's definitely an intensity about him, right? And I'd say that was true of prophets in general, right? And John not only seems to fit into that mold, but seems to have understood himself in that way, right? Seems to have styled himself in that way. So the clothing seems to have been, I've described it as Prophet Elijah cosplay,
Yes.
right? He's basically saying, I'm gonna dress the part, and you get what that means about me, right? But you also get what that means about our leaders, right? Because Elijah was sent in a time when our leaders were leading the people astray and were messing things up. And yeah, it's not surprising that Herod Antipas would take an interest in somebody who's saying, I'm Elijah here to deal with our present day Ahab and Jezebel kind of thing.
So
right?
there's kind of an anti-establishment sentiment going on here, it sounds like. Is that a fair way of saying it? I'm trying to kind of interpret some of this for how it might come across to people today if John the Baptist was here and now doing his thing. It just, I hear a lot of almost like anarchist vibes, or like, hey, the religious system that we're a part of is problematic, but maybe I'm reading my own culture into this. So how do you think about that when it comes to John the Baptist?
Yeah, no, I wrestled with this because John, as I was coming to conclusions, John seemed just so contemporary, right, with his concern for social and economic justice,
Right.
his anti-establishment stuff, things like that.
He's a rage against the machine kind of guy,
Yeah, and I was like, wait a minute, is this how much of this is me
Right.
and how much of this is John,
Right.
But it really does seem, I mean, figures, people, play, comparable roles, at different moments in history. And when we find somebody in history that we resonate with, we see that, we feel that, right? And we approach them. And so I did due diligence, or at least try to make sure I wasn't just reading myself into John, our own concerns into John, but that I was finding John so fascinating because, he's a figure who, if we make the analogies between the role he played in his time and what we think might be necessary in our time, then there seem to be some key points of contact. And so, yeah, I'm not sure what kind of metal music or otherwise other genre he might have played.
I need the data on that, though, James. I need the hard data.
Yeah, but I could definitely see him getting together, around the campfire and singing some anti-establishment types of songs or something like that. And anti-establishment music has varied, from age to age. But yeah, I mean, when you think about, let's say, the rock band, heavy metal band member, right? If you imagine somebody who is a pastor, has a son, and the son is a bit of a rebel, you could imagine him doing the heavy metal thing, and maybe even doing the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, booze and all the stuff, and being a rebel in that way, right? And John seems to be a rebel, right, against the establishment, but in a very different way.
Okay,
right?
tell me.
And if we think about the prophets of ancient Israel, right, they were often very anti-establishment, but they weren't it's not because they were anti-religion, right? They were like, you guys are doing your religion so badly, that I'm going to come here and shake things up, right? And so if we think about John, whose father was a priest, right, and yet John is doing this quasi-priestly thing, right, this thing that's kind of priestly, he's offering forgiveness, but he's not doing it through the temple and through animal sacrifice. And so that's less like the son of the fundamentalist preacher who goes and starts the heavy metal band, and more like the son of a fundamentalist preacher who opens a competing church and tries to basically steal the entire flock away to hear a different sort of message than they'd hear from his father.
But maybe with like some rock and roll overtones. Because I'm really, man, I'm you know what? This is my podcast. This is T&E podcast. We can do this. I'm going to kind of go off a little detour here and kind of circle back. Because what I'm hearing you talk about is this concept of maybe, and again, if I'm not accurate, interrupt me and say, no, that's not right. But let's just start here. It sounds like what you're saying is that John the Baptist was someone who was like, hey, our religious tradition is corrupt, and we have to get back to or push forward into this tradition to find, a better way, or maybe a more authentic, whatever it is, a better way of doing our religion better. Or maybe making it more expansive, right? Because you talk about this idea, like you just said, where John's saying, you know what, how about we forgive sins outside the temple and without animal sacrifice, which is, probably in his context, very unheard of, very, maybe even blasphemous. And so I think about how in our current moment, even me as a Christian, before I even deconstructed, there was a very close connection between heavy metal music that was all about like social justice and like loving our neighbor better. But it came out in this very like anti-establishment way, but it was actually very religious, even more so than my mainstream churches. Does that make sense? So I kind of picture that going on here with John the Baptist.
Okay, for the benefit of your listeners who may not know this, you know my penchant for making parody songs,
yes.
And you may or may not have heard the one that I did in connection with this book. It's not. I mean, it's certainly not. It's not death metal, but I did a version instead of Pat Benatar's Heartbreaker. I did Christmaker.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, I'm totally on board with the analogy. I don't know that we have any clear indication of kind of the musical innovation. We certainly don't have amps that could produce distortion.
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah.
So that kind of
right.
that kind of ruins it. Had he had the technology, then he would have used
possible,
it, right? Just like I think if John if there'd been coffee, right? I mean, first of all, it would have made an even bigger impact because he would have had the caffeine, right? But I think he would have been with his followers in coffee shops, right? I mean, I think one of the things we miss thinking about him as a wild man, right? Almost like a hermit, right? Which he clearly was not, because he made a huge impact on people and was famous in his time, is that he was a thinker, right? As well as a feeler, right? And a proclaimer. He was somebody who gathered some great minds around him, right? And a number of those become the founding people of what becomes Christianity, right? Not just Jesus, but we're told in the Gospels that some of Jesus' key supporters and disciples encountered him for the first time in the circles around John the Baptist, right? And clearly the people who wrote these early Gospels, the thinkers who formulated Christian theology, were no slouches, right? That doesn't mean that they were literate in the modern way that we think of literacy. In the ancient world, most people could not write their thoughts with their own hand using the stylus that was available, and ink and expensive parchment or papyrus. That was a very technical skill in that time.
Right.
And whether or not they had that kind of education has no bearing on whether they were creative thinkers, whether they were skilled poets and innovators, ones who would write great heavy metal lyrics if they had the guitars to go with it, but who definitely would be able to formulate things in a way that was had the same power that song lyrics do, right? That has that ability to capture somebody's vision, to work on the heart and the mind and the soul all together. And John seems to me to be that sort of figure. And to the extent that we think of him as somebody you would want to like steer clear of because he seems, seriously unwashed, eating very strange food, and a little bit unhinged. If that's our perception, then we must have John wrong, because the impact he makes, right? He has followers as far afield as Asia Minor and possibly Alexandria, depending on where Apollos came across this and became part of the way and knew only John's baptism, right? This is somebody who's famous, right? He's more famous than Jesus in his time, because, and he starts beforehand, and Jesus at first is known through association with John. And that's hard for most Christians to imagine, because if they've heard of John the Baptist, it's because of Jesus, right?
Yeah, let's just pause there for a second, because you're right. In my head, it's reversed. Like, Jesus made John great. John didn't make Jesus great. So that's, can you expand more on that and like how you found that out? Is there a scripture to support this? Is it off in other sources? Like, give me the background around like John's fame, I guess, and how well known he was and how he was actually ahead of Jesus. I think even in the book you hint that Jesus could have been influenced by John's teachings before he started his ministry. Give me that. Unpack that for me.
Yeah. And something I encountered when I wrote What Jesus Learned from Women is that there are many Christians who struggle with the idea, or maybe simply reject the idea, that Jesus learned anything from anyone, right? And they seem not to realize that makes them heretical by the standards of the classic creeds, because Jesus was fully human as well as fully divine, according to classic orthodoxy. And to be fair, classic orthodoxy has defined Jesus in a way, fully God, fully human. And how do we fit those together?
Right.
Well, you're going to have to make some room for mystery. and hasn't given us a lot to go on,
Right.
except to say it's not this, not that, not
Right.
that, not that.
Yes.
And the truth is that
Right.
when push comes to shove, the church has always ditched aspects of his humanity in practice in order to affirm divinity. But if we affirm that Jesus was fully human, then, right, he had to learn his mother tongue, right? And some of the apocryphal stories of him coming out from the womb already speaking and stuff like that, that suggests he wasn't human like us in every way. It's just those don't fit, right? Either historically or doctrinally. So that could be a hurdle. But once you overcome that hurdle, as I think we must, just to do justice to Jesus' humanity, then it won't be a problem to realize that Jesus associates with John's movement, right? He goes to John, is baptized by him, and is in some way part of this, right? And even according to the Gospels, only does his own thing after John is imprisoned, right? And then he starts regrouping these individuals that, reading just Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we might think he's calling them for the first time, but we read the Gospel of John and we find out, oh, of course, he already knew these people. They were part of John's movement. So he's not calling them for the first time. He's regrouping John's disciples.
Wait. Pop the brakes.
Yeah.
You're saying that the first disciples that Jesus calls, I had this impression that they were just like these rando fishermen or wherever, tax collectors,
Right.
just doing their work. And Jesus is like, I call you to become fishers of men. They go, great, I'm in. They just drop their nets and follow this stranger and embark on this journey that changes the world. You're saying that's most likely not the case, but actually Jesus already knew who they were and was continuing on in the tradition that John laid before him?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great summary. And you're not alone in thinking that. I mean, that's what I thought too, right? I mean,
mind.
You start out in the Christian faith and it's just like, well, Jesus is just such an impressive person that all you have to say is follow me. Right. And the halo is so bright that you're like, okay, I'm with him.
Okay.
Right?
But can I just say, I know I'm interrupting you a lot, James, forgive me, but this is, I'm kind of processing with you in real time.
Yeah.
This makes more sense, though. What you just the theory. I'm not sure what you would call it. The theory, the plausibility, the thesis that Jesus probably knew these people ahead of time because he worked alongside them in John's ministry makes way more sense than these rando people that Jesus found just left everything to follow him, right? So again, I want to point out to the audience that, and I don't want to speak too I don't want to speak too derogatory here, but once again, like the narrative that many of us were given doesn't really make a lot of sense. And something like this makes way more sense. But I'm not sure about you, audience. I've never, ever, until I read this book and talked to James, heard the concept that Jesus probably knew who his first disciples were ahead of time and then called them to continue on the work of what John the Baptist laid. I mean, it makes more, it's almost like a aha moment of, oh, right, of course that makes more sense. But I never thought of it until right now.
Yeah. And this is not just me saying, well, hey, this would make more sense historically, which I think it does, but it's me bringing together what we get in what are known as the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which tend to have a lot of similarities between them, and combining it with what we get in the Gospel of John, right, in which there's this period of activity when it sounds like Jesus might be baptizing. Certainly the group around him is engaged in baptizing activity. And this is before John is imprisoned. And Jesus encounters some of those same disciples that are mentioned, in the other Gospels when John the Baptist is proclaiming his message, right? And so we get just read the first chapter of the Gospel of John. And of course, there too, right, our attention is distracted. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Okay, there's so much theology in those first 18 verses that, you might be overwhelmed and, not be paying attention to, okay, so who are the names in here again? But then you get, sort of Andrew and and it's like, wait, those are those same ones that, because in the other Gospels, it essentially says, Jesus goes and is baptized, and then it says, and when John was put in prison, then he went into Galilee and was proclaiming the message. And so the historian has to take these and either say, okay, we have sources here that don't present things the same way, and so maybe I have to choose between them. And some historians actually do, just ignore the Gospel of John because it's so different. But I think that there are lots of places where the Gospel of John actually gives us useful historical information that is not contradictory to, but complementary to what the other sources say. And when we put them together, then it's like, oh, okay, they're part of John's movement. John is imprisoned. His disciples scatter. Jesus, spends some time in the wilderness reflecting on, what he's called to do, and different routes that he might follow and different temptations he might face, and then shows up and starts regrouping his disciples. And it's interesting that in one source, not a Christian source, but that one that's about John the Baptist, there's this parable of a soul fisher, right? Fisher for souls, which is basically like fishing for people, right? Fishing for human lives. And so I wonder whether even in using that expression, I'll make you fishers of people, Jesus wasn't using an expression that they'd already associate with John the Baptist. I'm just saying,
wow,
we're not done yet.
Right. Okay. Wow. That's new information that I need to process for sure. Hi friends, if you're enjoying this video, I have a favor to ask. The New Evangelicals is a 501c3 nonprofit, and if you've looked around at all, you've probably noticed that we don't offer member subscriptions on YouTube or Patreon options. The reason for this is very simple. It's been our mission since the beginning to offer all of our content and community resources completely paywall free. What this means is that we are completely dependent on the generosity of people like you who donate to make this work possible and accessible for all. If our content has helped you, would you consider donating to keep it all going? You can find the link in the description of this video, and to be very clear, this is not about giving to God or something like that. We're not a church and this is not a tithe. The ask is so simple. If our work has helped you, would you be willing to help us make this content accessible to more and more people? All donations made in the US are tax deductible and every bit helps. Thank you for your generosity. So it sounds like so far we have this established that John and Jesus were part of this separate or whatever, this movement inside their own religious tradition, which in this case is Judaism. What were some of the big differences between what John the Baptist and his crew were pushing that would have been at odds with, for lack of a better phrase, like the established sense of religion, etc.? Like what are some of the big differences? You mentioned already forgiveness without animal sacrifice or forgiveness outside the temple. In the book, you talk a lot about baptism and water. So maybe that's another one. Can you kind of break down some of those big differences?
Yeah. And so let's start with the animal sacrifice, because I think it's easy, I think particularly for Christians, but maybe for just about everyone today, who, even when we have even when you have your annual church barbecue, right? I mean, there's not a lot of actual slaughtering of animals going on, and doing stuff with the blood, right? It's a much more sanitized, supermarket enhanced sort of event, right? Very different. Although the end result of people eating meat is kind of the same, but otherwise is very different. And so thinking of that as the way that people sought forgiveness is not usual for us. And baptism, of some sort or other, is something that Christians take for granted. And so the question of how did anyone ever come up with this idea, right? Okay, sure, he's a prophet, he's inspired by God, fine. But people come up with imagery. Imagery is used by prophets that makes sense, and conveys the message to people, right? And so what did this imagery mean? Right. So on the one hand, we have this challenge to the centrality of the temple. And there I want to emphasize, because there's a long history of Christians playing things that Jesus taught, or even that John the Baptist taught, that Paul writes, whatever, over against Judaism, right?
Yes, this is a very common trope I hear often. I grew up hearing, etc. Yeah.
And so what I think John was doing, and then Jesus and others after him, right, who were part of the same movement, influenced by him, they're rediscovering, right, that from the outset, right, I was just preaching on this passage, right, I was invited to preach, and the lectionary text was when David has this idea, hey, I'm going to build a temple, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's so perfect, right, because I think that story is probably one that John would have revisited, right, because Nathan's initial response, Nathan the prophet, initially is like, God likes all of your ideas, so go with it, sure. And then he has a dream in which God is like, did I ever ask anyone to do this? Right? And is recalling the tabernacle, right? God made a mobile place of worship, right? That could go where everybody was, and it might not be in your neighborhood all the time, but it shows up there, right? Periodically. And David's talking about locking in the place where people worship centrally in his capital city, right? And so it's a shrewd move, right? And it's it's not one that, however, I'm not saying that he wasn't devoutly religious as he was thinking about this, but he's also a political leader, and he's obviously going to put it, if he's going to build this thing, he's obviously going to put it in his capital city. And we as human beings have mixed motives, right? And so from the very beginning, we have this sort of pushback against this idea that the temple is a good innovation. It's not there in the Jewish law, right? There's instructions for a tabernacle. There's nothing about a temple, right? And so I think that John, discovering that he was not going to be going into his father's line of work, as it were, but having a sense that he's surely supposed to be doing something that's related, started rediscovering these things, right? He's depicted as a lifelong Nazirite, right? Somebody who's dedicated to God, will never cut their hair. So the hair is the one thing that I think maybe is just about right. He may have had it done up in a bun or something. I'm not sure.
Man. A man bun.
I need a turban for this guy, right? But he probably noticed that Samuel, right, who's one of the few other lifelong Nazirites, dedicated before birth in the Jewish scriptures, in the Christian Old Testament, and he's offering sacrifices, and yet he's not a priest, right? And so I think John was discovering that there's this diversity in the Bible, right? Because he's realizing that he's torn between these different possible vocations. And so he turns to baptism, right? And people were immersing in water. And as a matter of course, they were doing it for reasons of cleanliness, but also ritual purification. And John harnesses this imagery that's also there throughout the Bible, right? And I think another text that might have influenced him profoundly is Isaiah chapter 1, right? Where the prophet, right, hundreds of years before John the Baptist, is like, I've had enough of your sacrifices. Get rid of your songs. All your worship is displeasing me. I want justice, right? But in the connection with that, he says, wash yourselves in water and make yourselves clean, and then purify your actions. And I think John found in texts like that a manifesto for his own mission, right? That where others were saying, look, the time is here. Finally, God's going to act. I know we've been waiting a long time, but finally God's going to make everything right for us, and everything's going to be great, and we're going to be on top of the world, and we're going to be in charge of everything. And John is like, the reason it hasn't happened yet is because we've been screwing up completely, utterly, profoundly all along. We've been refusing to do what God wants. And guess what? God's called me to give you one last chance. And if we can get our acts together, then we can hope for some of this. But otherwise, we should expect judgment and for God to wash his hands of us.
So, okay. So what is, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is like, and again, I could be totally reading John into my own context, but like the work that I do, I can tell you very clearly what I'm at odds with, or what this community is at odds with when it comes to the evangelical establishment, right? On particular issues, how they view the Bible, etc. If you had to kind of like nail down the top few reasons, 3 to 5 reasons of, okay, John the Baptist and his crew were really opposed, or they believed something different on these issues, what would those things be? Like, what are some of the big deal breakers, I guess we could say, for John the Baptist when they look at what's happening in the religious context compared to what they're trying to do in their moment?
Yeah, so I mean, I think he's clearly got a concern with social and economic justice. Okay. And I think that was probably one of the inspirations behind his offer of forgiveness of sins through baptism.
So John was a Marxist. Okay, got it. Next,
Well, the possibility that there was some sharing of goods there, that it didn't start with Acts, that John may have been doing that. But what's interesting, as I was trying to figure out why John gives the particular instructions that he does to particular categories of people, right, but also how it was that this figure is somebody that we're told, tax collectors and prostitutes were drawn to him and were listening to him and were responding to him. That's not your stereotypical fundamentalist preacher, right?
Totally.
Right? I mean, you occasionally have somebody who has a turnaround. They're last at the end of their rope, and they're watching some televangelist on TV or something. But that's the exception, right? Whereas we get the sense that these people in particular were drawn to John, whereas the religious establishment folks were worried about him and troubled by this. And so John says to folks like soldiers and tax collectors, be satisfied with your pay. Don't extort money. Don't take more than what you're owed. And that might seem so obvious. Of course, you don't take more than you're owed, right? Unless you're a really greedy, but the ancient taxation systems, and you have soldiers who are underpaid for their work and things like that. And so all of these things had woven into them a tipping system, right? Except the tip is required, right? Here's your tax bill, and for a party of your size, we're going to add a 20% gratuity to this, right? It's kind of it was sort of woven into it that if you are working in this field, it's only so that you can maybe provide some sort of hedge against the constant threat of starvation and poverty to you and your family by ripping off other people, right? And so you go work for the chief tax collector, and you start doing this thing, and you better yourself at the expense of others, and everybody's doing. And John doesn't say, okay, quit your jobs. Doesn't say, okay, no more soldiering for you, even though he seems to have had a nonviolent streak. What he says is, buck the system in that little area that depends on you, right? So he'd like to see the system change, and whether he thought that if you get enough people on board, the system will change, or it's going to take a miracle and God's going to have to intervene, or it's going to be a bit of both, is harder to say. But in the meantime, don't use the fact that you can't unilaterally change the system and the whole system is corrupt as an excuse for not doing what's right within your sphere of influence. And I think that these people who were caught up in the system and knew that it was terrible, right? And knew that it's turning them into people that they didn't like being, right? And wouldn't be, except that it seemed like the only way to survive, right? And I think that's why these people found something meaningful in John, right? He's calling them to change, but he's not saying, you're terrible, you're so much worse than the religious elite. He's like, everybody's got their hands dirty. Let's keep hoping for God to do that miraculous thing, bring in the kingdom of God. But in the meantime, in your sphere of influence, do what's right. And that's going to be controversial, right? And the tax, that's controversial. Your family might not like it because you're not, your employer, right? Or your commander in chief of your particular battalion might not like that you're not going along with everything. But he's got this practical message that's very social justice oriented, but in a very pragmatic sort of way that I think connected with people in his time.
Yeah, that's helpful. It's as you're talking about John the Baptist, I just hear bigger themes of. It seems like even in the Bible there are these figures. I think you mentioned Elijah earlier. The prophet, etc. Many others, I'm sure, that seem to be kind of pushing up against the status quo religiously. And then I think about even broader in the Christian tradition, how there have been Christians. I mean, Martin Luther, maybe one of the most iconic in our moment, right? Who started the Protestant Reformation and nailed his 99 Theses to the wall. It seems like, and I'm sure other religions have this too, but in Christianity, there's always people who are trying to kind of push for things to be either different. And even though maybe there's a call to go back, it's still a push forward ultimately, right? Because you're still kind of drawing on the idea of a more pure and unadulterated religion that lives up to the calling and standards that it claims to have. And it seems like, based on what you're saying, that John the Baptist is one of these people that is participating in this line of other religious leaders who are saying, the status quo isn't good enough. There are some people in power that I think are actually doing more harm than good, and we have an obligation to push things into a better direction. And this is the key. And I don't want to read my own bias into John. So if I am, let me know. Is John pushing for a more accessible God? Meaning like, hey, you know what? What if you could have forgiveness not only in the temple, but you could have forgiveness outside the temple? It sounds like this idea of like, one of the people I listened to, Tim Mackey from the Bible Project, he talks about this theme of God's blessing going outwards. It's always expanding out. And I like that a lot. And I almost hear some elements of that happening here with John the Baptist, but I fully acknowledge I'm more progressive in my theology these days. And so I don't want to read my own bias into what's happening with John in his context. What are some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I had the same concern that, again, am I bringing this to John and to my research, or is this actually there?
Right, exactly.
And it's good. I think the key is to keep asking that, right? Because we're never going to be asking from some sort of God's eye view up in the sky where we're not ourselves inhabiting our own human lives and experience and our moments in history, and so we can only ask from where we are. But I think that the reason why some of us have ended up in this sort of progressive outlook is because we've been influenced by Jesus, who was influenced by John. And so it's actually, and John was influenced by, Amos and Micah and Isaiah and other folks before him who had some of this message as well. Not always, equally radically inclusive, but always expanding the boundaries in some way, pushing back and saying, we don't need more worship and more sacrifice. We need more kindness and more justice and more, more fairness and, less injustice and less oppression. And John is very much on the same page, I think. And so even though he's doing this thing that's religiously innovative, right, this baptism for the forgiveness of sins, it's, I think, noteworthy that he's not focusing on a lot of, even though I think there must have been some ritual elements for it to, mediate the kind of experience that people had. Sure. He's not focused on that, right? If anything, he's drawing people together that normally would have, not made common cause, where others were trying to finally bring God's favor back by being as separate from everyone else who is doing things wrong as possible. And so you have the Pharisees, with emphasis on ritual purity. We have the Essenes, some of whom even lived in isolation from others. And John doesn't seem to share those kinds of concerns or their kind of outlook, right? He's not a hermit. He's somebody who's connecting with, if anything, the wrong sort of people, the kinds of people that were then associated with Jesus, right? For the same reason.
Right. I mean, I think often I really do try and be careful between what does the text first actually say, and then what do we do with how we interpret that text, right? And so I fully just want to acknowledge in front of the audience that I understand that I have a bias and that I have my own way of seeing the world, and that it definitely lands me in especially in our cultural moment way more on the quote unquote progressive side of things. Maybe not so much theologically, but definitely politically. I acknowledge that. But part of what got me here was listening to Bible nerds, Bible scholars say often, like, hey, there is a theme here of God working in the world, and this understanding of God and how God works in the world, always kind of going and reaching new people and new ways of being, and this idea of God's hand of blessing being expanded first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. I even think about Paul, right? So Paul literally says, hey, it's not circumcision anymore. It's circumcision of the heart. Like, he totally shifts what would be just like an understood part of being in the family of God. Like, just, I mean, the first act of our forefather Abram was, getting circumcised. We've always done this. Paul's like, well, what if it's about circumcision of the heart and not a physical thing? And then there's this council, and they agree. And so it just seems like there is this theme on a big picture throughout the scripture, and then also throughout the Christian tradition, of us thinking about and reinterpreting the tradition that was handed on to us, as Scott McKnight would say, and pushing forward for it in our day and in our way. And I just think that's a very important thing to pull out here, because a lot of the tradition that I was handed to me, albeit by well-intentioned people, was much more like static and like, no, this is just how it has always been. These have been the rules since the beginning. God never changes. These people are always on the out unless they repent and give up whatever this quote unquote sin is. And we can't think about things differently because it's always been this way. But as I've had the amazing pleasure and privilege of having folks like yourself on the podcast now for over 3 years, I mean, just amazing people who take this stuff and their faith, many of them, very seriously, I've just been given a very different picture of what's actually going on in some of these texts, as opposed to this static idea of God is this, here's the boundaries, here's the rules, they're never going to change, no one's ever thought about them differently, and for you to think about them differently puts you outside of Christianity. I'm just not convinced anymore, frankly.
Yeah, and I think, by the time we get to Paul, things have progressed, to use, maybe that's the right word to use, in a particular direction.
Sure.
But John is already sort of getting the ball rolling and laying a foundation that Paul can later build on when he says, don't say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our forefather, right? God can raise up children of Abraham from these stones, right? And so John is not yet thinking, as far as we can tell, right? We don't have anything explicit that says he's thinking, oh, yeah, mission to the Gentiles. And if so, will it be with or without circumcision or anything like that? We don't have anything explicit that indicates. But he's definitely thinking in terms of, undermining this idea that one nation, because it had some special privileges in terms of, special relationship and opportunities to, connect with God that others may not have had, that's supposed to mean, yeah, so you're fine, everybody else is screwed, and if anything, it's privilege that comes with responsibility, right? With great power comes great responsibility, as someone once said. More than one someone, depending on which universe you're in. Anyway, for those of us who know that.
I just watched that movie last night, by the way. I was like, it's such a good movie. Anyway, okay. Side note, keep going. I'm listening.
Finally, I actually got caught up on that in flight. I just got back from Australia a few days ago, and that was like in flight. Just finally getting caught up on something.
Love that.
So, anyway, but John is doing that, and on the other hand, we see some of that sort of 12 tribes, connection happening around him, right? We get hints that he's active in areas that are, sort of in Samaria. His tomb, or one of the tombs supposedly belonging to John the Baptist, is in Samaria today, which I'm not sure that traditional sites are necessarily historical ones, but they indicate something sometimes about how a figure was understood, right? It's like, this seems like a place where John the Baptist might have a tomb. And we have disciples associated with him that are from Samaria, according to some of our sources. And so I think that John is at least pushing the boundary by saying, okay, yeah, this attempt to have, Judah, be the dominant force and to subject everyone else, that's what got the whole division of the people started, right? And then you get the building of a temple, and then you get competing temples in the north. And it's like, none of this has actually led to greater justice, to greater righteousness, to people actually being better, despite all of this attempt at religious innovation, and then trying to get back to greater purity here, greater do this, just interpret it right, and then exclude everybody else who gets it wrong. And none of that's actually leading to us doing more of what the prophets of ancient Israel said was important, which is to do justice, right, love mercy, walk humbly with our God. And that's, I think John is emphasizing that, and that's not something that pits him over against Judaism. That's him standing in the long line of the prophetic tradition, right? Yeah. And I think he probably recognized, as many modern progressives do, that there's more than one voice in the scriptures, right? Yeah. There is a strand of tradition in the Bible that thinks the temple is great, and thinks that the kingship is great, and the kingship, Judah, and the line of David ruling over everyone else, that's going to be great. But we also, if we're listening closely, we also have the, not so great, right? Yeah. And I think John, in his time, was probably studying the scriptures closely enough that he was noticing those things. Because it certainly isn't just modern people who come along. It's like, wow, we're seeing all this stuff. It's like, you start reading some of the ancient, commentators and things. They may have dealt with some of this stuff differently,
right?
But they were capable of seeing these things, and I think it's absolutely plausible historically to say that John was noticing these things as well, and taking them into account and making them part of his message, his vision, and so on.
Well, once again, it's always a pleasure to have someone come on and really unpack, especially a biblical character that so many of us feel like we know, only to have someone say, well, maybe there's some elements here, but there's more going on. Again, friends, the book is called Christmaker, A Life of John the Baptist. Now, the other cool thing, James, is that you're going to be with me and many other people at Theology Beer Camp this October. I think it's the 17th through the 20th, something like that. Friends, you can get tickets at the link in our bio. Amazing people will be there. Diana Butler-Bass, Pete Enns will be there. Adam Clark, of course, Trip 4, April LaJoy, my co-host on Fridays. She's coming now. So it's going to be a great time. Get your tickets, promo code TNE Hobbit. Go to the link in your show notes or in the YouTube notes to find that. It's going to be a great time in Denver, Colorado. We can talk more about this and all the other nerdy stuff that we couldn't get to. James, it was really a pleasure having you on. Thanks for making time.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. And yeah, if not sooner, see you at Theology Beer Camp.
Can't wait.